Welcome, everyone. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump's shakeup of the international status quo has caught many U.S. allies off guard. Now, everyone knew there will be controversy with his re-election, especially America's adversaries, and they, for the most part, have dug in and prepared themselves for 4 years of unpredictable and provocative rhetoric and action. But then there are those who call themselves friends of America, the Canadians and Europeans who are hoping this term may be different from Trump's first, soon realize they are the target of a trade war waged by the 47th U.S. president, criticized again for lack of NATO spending, and left out of a meeting to end the Ukraine war with Moscow, and also witnessing the emergence of a unique and tense relationship with Washington unseen since the Second World War. These transatlantic rifts and what they mean for tomorrow's world order is the focus of PressTV's Spotlight program. Now here's a quick report first.
The Ukraine war has fundamentally shaken up international relations. A dramatic shift in U.S. policy under Trump has ignited tensions between Washington and its European allies, complicating an already fragile relationship. The European Union and its member states have so far committed a staggering 135 billion euros to support Ukraine. But with Trump's new direction, Europe is ramping up its military expenditures.
We need a massive surge in defense without any question. We want lasting peace, but lasting peace can only be built on strength, and strength begins with strengthening ourselves.
In his first congressional address, Donald Trump accused his European allies of hypocrisy, claiming they continue trading with Russia, boosting its economy during the war. Trump also said Europe is spending less than Washington to support Kiev, igniting further discord.
Europe has sadly spent more money buying Russian oil and gas than they have spent on defending Ukraine, by far. Think of that. And we've spent perhaps $350 billion, like taking candy from a baby. That's what happened. And they've spent $100 billion. What a difference that is. And we have an ocean separating us, and they don't.
This growing rift is raising alarms across NATO, with many leaders expressing concern that Trump's actions are eroding trust within the alliance. European leaders are now increasingly calling for greater strategic autonomy in response to U.S. isolationist tendencies. Friedrich Merz, Germany's chancellor-in-waiting, warned that Europe must bolster its defenses and even consider alternatives to NATO if the U.S. continues to sideline European security. Trump's pressure on Europe extends beyond Ukraine. The U.S. president recently threatened to slap a hefty 25% tariff on European cars and other goods, accusing the EU of unfair trade practices. This move has sparked outrage among European leaders, with France and Spain warning of reciprocal responses. With Washington seemingly turning its back on its European allies, Europe is left grappling with a daunting question: how to bolster its own defense and keep its economy on the right track without full reliance on the U.S. The economic woes and energy insecurities plaguing the continent make this an uphill battle.
And now for our guests. Joining us is Mr. John Bosnitch, journalist, activist, and political analyst from Fredericton, Canada. And George Szamuely, a senior research fellow from Global Policy Institute from London Metropolitan University from Budapest, Hungary. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I'd like to welcome you both. Hope you're both safe and doing well. I guess we'll start there with you, John, Mr. John Bosnitch in Canada. Your opening thoughts on this reemergence of another Trump administration in Washington and its continued hostility toward America's closest allies.
Well, I know that my position is quite uncommon in Canada, but I'm very happy to see Trump back because I think that Trump is less of a deep state creature than Biden and his regime. And I think that Trump can go down in history as being an anti-war president if he succeeds in pulling America out of the NATO war machine. So despite all of the saber rattling and all of the scary words, I think there's a good chance here that we're going to see an unwinding of the NATO war machine. And that's the machine that has been bringing war to Ukraine. That is the machine that has been bringing war to Africa. That is the machine that has been bringing war threats all around the world. So I think it's a good thing, despite the fact that he looks scary and he sounds mean. The fact is, Donald Trump is a businessman, not a war maker.
Thank you, John. And George Szamuely, welcome to the program. George, Trump's trade wars that he's kicked off with a number of countries, but we're going to stick with Canada and the Europeans. His policy on Ukraine and his continued criticism of NATO and lack of European spending on NATO. Not just that lack of spending on NATO, he's actually even undermined NATO's relevance at this point. And this has really irked U.S. allies. Your initial take on this?
Well, I agree with John Bosnitch. I think anyone who does anything to weaken NATO is doing the Lord's work on earth. The question, however, is whether this will indeed lead to the unraveling and eventual dissolution of NATO. And there, I think I have serious doubts. So while it is true that Donald Trump really for many, many years, long before he became president, was a NATO skeptic, he didn't really see correctly any reason for NATO's continued existence after the end of the Cold War. However, he, like every U.S. president, understands that NATO, malign entity though it is also a mechanism for the U.S. to project its power in the world. And so if Trump were threatened by the unraveling of NATO, I think he would try to stop this happening. And we saw this during his first term when in 2018, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, started suggesting that, well, maybe there should be a European dimension, maybe the Europeans should do more to take care of their own security, something that you would think Trump would be sympathetic to. Yeah, sure, absolutely great idea, take care of your security. When Macron said that, Trump went absolutely crazy and started denouncing Macron and said that we Americans, we saved you in World War I. We saved you in World War II. We won the Cold War for you. And now you dare to turn around and stab us in the back. So NATO is just much too useful for the United States. If NATO were to disappear, the United States would just be a regional power. It would just be a hemispheric power. Whereas the United States aspires to be a global superpower, the #1 power in the world. And I think that's what Trump would like to see. He just wants to see the Europeans pay a lot more into the NATO kitty, and he wants the division of labor. The European powers take care of security in Europe, while the Americans focus on China.
Thank you there. And John, you mentioned you see Donald Trump as less of a deep state guy, less of a warmonger. But tell me how that fares when you look at the U.S. and you look at U.S. throughout its history, and I'm sure you heard the statistics from the last 240 years it's been involved, over 223. There haven't been 18 years of peace where the U.S. has not, in one way or another, been at war somewhere in the world. Can the U.S. exist without war, death, and destruction?
Well, the United States, as it was constituted before Donald Trump returned to office, certainly could not exist. It's a war-driven economy, and it is a war-driven political system as well. So if Donald Trump is really the anti-war president that he says he is, and we have to remember, Donald Trump is the first U.S. president not to start a war since the 1920s. So far, given his first term and up until today, this is the one and only president within our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our grandparents not to have started a war. So let's presume that he's going to continue along the path that he's been on. I note that he did not mention Iran in his speech, despite all of his bellicose words before the election about Iran. So that's a good sign right there. Further, I think that Donald Trump spoke a lot about the killing and the dead bodies and all of the dead people in Ukraine. So I think we're looking at a situation here where Donald Trump says, if you Europeans want another war, it's going to be your war. You'll pay for it. You will send your boys to die. We're not sending Americans in there to die. And I think that the Europeans will back down. Germany has started 2 world wars. Germany is not going to be allowed by Donald Trump to start World War III. And I can tell you, most of the Germans that I know, and when I say most, I mean more than 3/4 of the Germans I know, are dead set against getting in any kind of a war with Russia or getting involved in Ukraine. So regardless of the fact that the US economy has been tooled into a war machine by the Democratic administrations that started most of the wars, we have a situation here where Donald Trump is trying to produce a productive economy, not producing weapons, but producing usable goods. And the fact that he has Elon Musk so close under wing implies that there could be a shift in the US economy using new technologies and AI to create a productive economy that is not based on killing people. He talked a lot about the dead people in his speech.
Right, and George, European leaders are increasingly, they're calling for a greater strategic autonomy now in response to Donald Trump's U.S. Isolationist policy. The French President Emmanuel Macron says France has to stop being a U.S. vassal state. I'm sure you heard that in the last couple of days. Germany's next chancellor coming in, Friedrich Merz, he said he wants Europe to strengthen its defense and even consider alternatives to NATO if the U.S. continues, these are his exact words, to neglect European security. Now he's speaking, George, of increasing military spending for Germany and Europe by the hundreds of billions of dollars, equivalent to what the U.S. nearly $1 trillion a year. This seems like it's the beginning of the end of something, doesn't it? And the dawn of something completely new geopolitically.
Well, it may seem to be that, but I think this is all just fantasy. I think it's all just big talk. Europe doesn't have hundreds of billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of euros to spend on the military. I mean, we've heard this many times before. We heard back in 2022 when Chancellor Scholz very grandly announced the so-called Zeitenwende, and everyone hailed this as finally Germany was going to throw off the shackles of its meekness and mildness since World War II, and Germany would start to exercise power in the world as befitting the great economic power it is. But of course, we never heard anything more about it, and Germany hasn't in any way been able to increase its military spending to the heights that Chancellor Scholz promised. So this is a lot of talk, and we've heard this before, and then it's not going to happen. And why isn't it going to happen? Because that really wasn't why NATO was created. NATO was created for the Europeans to enjoy their wealth, their welfare states, their comfortable lifestyles, and their defense would be taken care of by the United States. That was the deal. And that's why so many states in Europe are so eager to join NATO, not because they think that they're under any threat. Of course, no one is under any threat. No one seriously believes Russia is going to invade anybody. But it means that they don't have to pay anything for their defense, and that means they can enjoy their 6 weeks of vacations every year. They can enjoy their universal health care. They can enjoy their free education. They can enjoy their free university education. They can enjoy their unlimited unemployment benefits. All of that they enjoy because they don't pay anything for their defense. So the moment that you start to talk about now you've got to come up with hundreds of billions of euros, they're going to say, no, we're not. So when Ursula von der Leyen announced the other day, oh, we're going to have this 150 billion euros for our defense, but what she really meant, we're going to send all this 150 billion to Ukraine. She was saying, well, that this is going to be a loan. So the European states are going to borrow money from the European Commission, and then use this money to buy weapons, send those weapons to Ukraine, and then these same European countries are going to have to pay back the loan plus interest. Well, this is nuts. No one's going to go for it, and it's obviously a scam. But somehow the Europeans want to persuade themselves, because they got themselves stuck in this war that they never needed to get stuck into. And so they're now flailing around, trying to come up with some new concepts about European strategic autonomy, and flailing around trying to come up with some money that they don't actually have.
And where do you see these rifts, these transatlantic rifts with the Europeans, basically Trump losing Canada and the European free markets, the military alliances, the influence, the cohesion, the respect and trust between the U.S. and the Europeans? Once that is all in jeopardy, what's the future, the geopolitical landscape future for how you see it, John, for the future of Europe?
Well, first, let me say I agree with every single word that George Szamuely has said here. Things don't add up. And Trump is making it clearer than ever that they don't add up. Europe purports that it has no money for military weapons, but that's because they have a higher standard of living and a better, easier lifestyle than Americans do. And Trump knows that. Trump has traveled there. He has seen how they live, and he knows how Americans live, and he knows what life is like in the inner cities. I mean, he's from New York. He knows what many, many millions of Americans are doing. They're living on the streets. So let's review some of these points here. First of all, when we talk about Trump attacking Macron, that also has a personal aspect. Trump has zero respect for Macron. Trump refers to Macron as a man who was basically sexually abused by an older woman when he was underage. That's Macron in Trump's mind. So all political issues fall behind that. Then when we talk about the Europeans have been per capita richer than the average American for many years, and Trump resents that fact. He resents the fact that he is being asked to defend Europe against a non-existent Russian threat. Russia has no plans, and America knows this because American spies are infiltrated all across Russia. America knows that Russia has zero plans to invade Europe at all. In fact, it took Russia 8 years to intervene to protect ethnic Russians in Ukraine. In North America, the lie was that the war in Ukraine just started in February 2022. That is the big lie behind all of this. The war in Ukraine started in 2014. In 2014, Nazi swastika tattooed neo-Nazis in Ukraine, armed by the West, especially by England, started massacring and doing ethnic cleansing against ethnic Russians. We're not talking about Eastern Europeans here. We're talking about ethnic Russians, Russians of the same blood as Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin did not directly intervene in that war that started in 2014. He did not intervene until 8 years later. 8 years of war. There's no doubt that Vladimir Putin is anti-war. Vladimir Putin only had to intervene because his own security complex, his own people, the cousins and brothers and nephews and aunts and uncles of the Russians living inside of Ukraine said, "You're the Russian president. If you're not going to save our people, who will?" And that's how we got to where we are today. 8 years after the war started, Russia finally intervened, and Russia has made it clear. Russia could have attacked and taken Kiev, no trouble. Russia just skirted around and has secured the areas of Ukraine where the clear majority of the population are ethnic Russians speaking Russian. Now, this is what's happening. We're going to see a division of Ukraine, but if Ukraine tries with neo-Nazis and with German supporters and with some crazy ultra-nationalist Frenchmen to try and fight Russia, they will lose and Kiev will be taken too.
And George, when you speak of U.S. unilateral actions taken, places where the Europeans felt they should be part of the discussion and they weren't. Let's speak of the abandonment in Trump's first term of the JCPOA, about the Afghanistan withdrawal, about realigning with Russia in the past couple of weeks, possibly at Europe's expense. Tell me that doesn't weigh heavily on the European leadership there.
Well, the problem for the Europeans is they're demanding a seat at the negotiating table, but they haven't done anything to deserve a seat at the negotiating table. They do not want peace. And that's the condition for a place on the table. You have to show the Trump administration that you're interested in peace. That was the problem for Zelensky. Zelensky made clear when he was in the Oval Office last week that he wanted the war to continue. And that's why he continued to denounce the Russians, denouncing Putin, just went on and on and on, which is not what Trump wanted to hear. Trump wanted to hear that Zelensky wants to bring this war to an end. But the Europeans are in exactly the same situation. Well, how did they respond to what happened in the Oval Office? They hugged and embraced, showered love and kisses on Zelensky when he came to London, and then presented a so-called peace plan that wasn't a peace plan at all. It was a plan to sabotage any possibility of peace by declaring that there are going to be security guarantees for Ukraine, namely British, French coalition of the willing forces on the ground in Ukraine, boots on the ground, planes in the air, is the way Keir Starmer put it, something that is obviously unacceptable to the Russians, and something that is obviously a guaranteed, not security, but on the contrary, guarantee war. And so as long as the Europeans take that position, then there's no room for them at the negotiating table. And everything we've heard this week, not just last week, this week, with all this talk from Ursula von der Leyen, all this 150 billion euros. Today, Macron is talking about using this 200 billion euros of Russian frozen assets and giving it all to Ukraine. Everything that they're saying is a desperate ploy to keep this war going. Well, if you want to keep a war going, then there's no room for you at the peace talks. I mean, that's just common sense.
We're almost out of time. Let me get this last question to John. John, the U.S. has for a while now had waning influence in West Asia, and now with the current climate that we're witnessing in Europe, one has to ask, is Donald Trump here to accelerate the inevitable decline of U.S. hegemony, or does he feel that the U.S. is on the decline due to its push for global hegemony, and he wants to correct that?
Both are correct, and he stated both in his speech. It's very, very telling that Donald Trump made reference only to George Washington in his speech, because it was George Washington, the first president of the United States, who left office with what is called the farewell address. Every one of your viewers should read it. It's on the net. George Washington's final words to the American people who he had led to independence was, "Do not become an empire. Be a republic, be an American republic, and do not repeat the mistakes of those who colonized this continent." George Washington and Donald Trump are on the same wavelength. Donald Trump wants a strong, independent republic that is not backing Germany's Drang nach Osten, which is drive to the east, and which is not backing England's effort to make Russians and Americans fight each other. Those two things Donald Trump will not allow.
And George, really quick, in less than 40 seconds, NATO. Is NATO overpriced, overextended, and more a problem producer or a problem solver?
It's a problem producer, definitely not a problem solver. Wherever NATO goes, wars follow. All of the wars that have taken place in the last 40 years have been driven by NATO, and particularly by NATO expansion. The war in Yugoslavia, the war in Libya, the war in Georgia, the war in Ukraine, they've all been triggered by NATO and the constant need to expand and to justify its existence. As long as NATO is there, and as long as it's going to continue expanding, it's going to come into conflict with other powers, and therefore it is a danger to stability, security, and ultimately, it could lead to a nuclear conflagration. And we're still not out of the woods yet. But we've come very close to it in Ukraine.
Gentlemen, thank you both, and stay safe to both of you. John Bosnitch, journalist, activist, and political analyst, joining us out of Fredericton, Canada, and George Szamuely, senior research fellow out of London Metropolitan University, joining us from Budapest, Hungary. And viewers, this brings us to the end of your Press TV Spotlight program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.